Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. See, people are still joining us, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Nieleti Hanwana. I am a Senior Program Officer at the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Pathways to Conflict, the Impact of Climate Change on Violence. This is the first installment of the Foundation's 2025 Knowledge Against Violence speaker series. And the presentation today will explore the findings of HFG's recent Research and Policy and Brief report, The Impact of Climate Change on Conflict, by Dr. Vally Koubi. The report analyzes the research so far on the relationship between climate and conflict and concludes with key takeaways, policy recommendations, and areas for future study. As Dr. Koubi explains in the paper, while climate change is not the primary driver of conflict, it can exacerbate conflict risks, particularly in regions with weak governance, high inequality, and political instability. So the rise of extreme weather events increases the risk of conflict driven by their effects on economic stability, agriculture, and migration. Dr. Koubi will talk to us today about how to mitigate these risks by strengthening political institutions, fostering social cohesion, and effectively managing migration. So for those who are unfamiliar with our work, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation examines enduring and urgent problems of violence. Through basic and applied research, we aim to understand the causes, the manifestation, and control of violence, and we spread this knowledge to inform policy, practice, and public discourse, and of course to advance scholarship. Drawing from the Foundation's vast pool of scholars, grantees, and colleagues, HFG Speaker Series includes discussions of timely research and analysis of situations of violence, including war, crime, terrorism, intimate relationships, climate instability, as we'll discuss today, and political extremism. Our hope is that this informative space leads to knowledge sharing, and we therefore encourage each of you to engage with the speaker in the Zoom chat or using the Q&A functions. So before we get into the program, allow me to briefly run through today's agenda. Our session will begin with a presentation by Dr. Koubi that will take us to the end of the hour, during which we encourage you to all pose questions using the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. And following the presentation, Dr. Koubi will have a further 20 to 30 minutes to answer questions posed from the audience. The session, which is being recorded, will be made available on hfg.org. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Koubi to turn on her camera as I offer just a brief introduction. Hi. Vally Koubi is a professor and senior scientist at the Center for Comparative and International Studies at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology Zurich, ETH Zurich, and a professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Bern, Switzerland. Her research focuses on the social consequences of climatic changes and the determinants of domestic environmental policies and outcomes, as well as international environmental cooperation across countries and time. Her research on the social consequences of climatic changes aims at understanding the effects of climatic changes on migration and conflict, mainly in the developing world. Dr. Koubi received her undergraduate degree from the University of Athens, Greece, and her MS, MA, and PhD degrees from the University of Rochester. Dr. Koubi, thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nieleti, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank our host, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and especially Dr. Joel Goldman, for the kind invitation, and all of you for being here. Today, I will provide a brief overview of what we currently know about the relationship between climate change and conflict, drawing on existing research. I will highlight also key patterns in the literature, identified some gaps for future research, and offer a few reflections on the policy implications. And I need to share I'm so sorry, I forgot to do this. There we are. So sorry. So let's start. Climate change isn't just about the environment anymore. It is also a serious security challenge. Many academics, policymakers, and even global leaders like former US President Barack Obama and former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon have warned that climate change is a serious threat to peace and stability. When water becomes scarce or crops fail, like what we have seen in places like Darfur or the Lake Chad Basin, it can fuel tensions and even lead to violent conflict, especially in regions that are already struggling. The key question I'm addressing in this presentation is this: does climate change lead to conflict? And if it does, what are the pathways that connect the two? So, in this presentation, I will walk you through how climate change might lead to violent conflict, starting with the fact that some researchers see a direct connection where resource scarcity, like limited access to water or farmland, can fuel tensions and trigger violence, while others take a more indirect view, arguing that climate change acts as a threat multiplier. It doesn't cause conflict on its own, but it creates or makes existing problems such as economic hardship, crop failures, or displacement even worse, which in turn can increase the risk of conflict. To make this more concrete, let me show a visual of these two pathways, the direct and the indirect between climate change and conflict. Both the pathways begin with climate change up at the top. Of course, climate change refers to a long-term shifts in global temperatures. And unfortunately, very few studies have examined the effects of these long-term shifts on conflict, showing that cooler periods over the past 1,000 years have reduced crop yields and led to more conflict in the Northern Hemisphere, where some other studies have shown that droughts in the pre-modern China had led to the peasant rebellion. Today, or most of our research nowadays, focuses on climate variability. And climate variability refers to the short-term changes in temperature and rainfall, as well as extreme weather events, and I often refer to those as climate events, like droughts, storms, and floods. From here, the literature now diverges into two main lines of thinking. The first one focuses on the direct, one-step pathway linking climate stressors straight to conflict via some physiological and psychological processes and all the resource scarcity. While the second one focuses on the indirect and stresses a multi-step pathway such as reduced economic opportunities and forced migration, which create new pressures that highlight the risk of conflict. Conflict, again, as with climate, is measured in many different ways. Some studies look at individual level violence like assault or robberies. Others focus on social unrest, things like protests or riots, or on a larger scale conflicts such as communal violence, civil conflict, which usually measures with over 25 battle-related deaths, to civil wars, which extend this threshold to about 1,000, and even interstate wars, wars between states. Because there is no single definition on how violence reacts to climate change, in this presentation, I will include all these types of conflict. Let's now start with the first direct pathway, which is grounded in the so-called temperature aggression hypothesis. This theory suggests that rising temperatures can increase aggression by affecting our bodies and minds. High heat can raise adrenaline levels or make us more irritable and prone to hostile reactions. There is some fascinating evidence to support this. For example, studies have linked hotter days to spikes in violent behavior, from assault and homicide to more batters being hit by pitchers in Major League Baseball games. Also, a very recent study analyzes 1 billion tweets in the United States and finds strong evidence of a sharp worsening of the tone of the tweets when the temperature is above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. However, critics point out that climate change unfolds gradually, and when researchers look at long-term climate trends across major US cities, most find no clear connection between rising temperatures and violent crime, suggesting that the link may not be as straightforward as it seems. Moving now to the second direct pathway, this links climate change to conflict through resource scarcity. As climate change reduces access to vital renewable resources like water, farmland, and fish stocks, it intensifies competition, especially in areas already struggling with environmental stress and rapid population growth. This dynamic is rooted in the so-called Neo-Malthusian tradition theory, which suggests that scarcity drives groups to protect their access to dwelling resources, increasing the risk of intergroup conflict. For example, in Africa's Sahel region, rising temperatures and erratic rainfall have intensified clashes between farmers and pastoralist herders, competing over land and water. Again, a recent study shows that in areas where those groups coexist, just a 1 degree Celsius temperature increase raises the likelihood of conflict by 54%, which is quite huge. Similarly, warmer ocean temperatures of East Africa have reduced fish stocks, leading some fishermen to turn to piracy as an alternative likelihood. Of course, this result has been observed everywhere, but rather in the South China Sea, where the same warming has increased fish production, that has led to decrease in the piracy. Here I need to emphasize that since the late 2000s, high-resolution climate and conflict data had fueled research, a lot of research, on how climate variability affects violence. Some studies link rising temperatures, droughts, and floods to higher conflict risk, while others find a weak or not even any relationship. In some cases, disasters may even reduce violence through aid efforts that undermine rebel support. A key meta-analysis back about a decade old found that found a 14% rise in intergroup conflict for every 1 degree in Celsius warming. However, this specific study has been criticized a lot in that it oversimplifies complex social and political dynamics. There is also some research which shows that climate might also affect not domestic conflict, intrastate conflict, but also interstate conflict. Transboundary water resources like the Nile, Indus, and Tigris are especially vulnerable to climatic changes, as shifting rainfalls and rising temperatures affect their flow. This can increase tensions between countries that rely on shared rivers for drinking water, agriculture, and industry. For instance, Egypt fears Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam will reduce Nile water during droughts. Still, history shows that cooperation is more common than conflict. Many countries have signed water sharing agreements like the Nile Basin Initiative, offering a foundation for for a peaceful climate resilient solution. Now, I need to emphasize that this direct resource scarcity leads to conflict argument has not gone unchallenged. In fact, several important critiques have been raised in the literature. One of the most important ones, it's it points to the fact that this process of looking at the relationship seems to be overly deterministic. It tends to overlook that the ways in which communities adapt, cooperate, and innovate when facing scarcity. And also it strips conflict out of its local social and political concept. At the same time, we know that it's not just scarcity that can drive violence. Resource abundance can also play a role. For instance, increased rainfall has been linked to rising tensions in pastoral areas like in Sahel, where more water and vegetation can actually intensify competition. A related point is that armed groups do not passively respond to environmental conditions. They exploit them strategically. Boko Haram, for example, has been shown to time its movements and its attacks around resource-rich seasons or areas. And also other research has shown that dense vegetation and impassable roads can make easier for armed groups to carry out surprise raids in the Horn of Africa. On a broader scale, we also see how climate change is fueling interstate tensions, like in the Arctic, where melting ice is opening access to untapped resources and sparkling geopolitical competition. So overall, I have to state that there is no scholarly consensus on a direct causal link between climate change and conflict. And this brings me to the important nuance here. While there is no universal causal link between climate change and conflict, evidence does suggest that this relationship is conditional. It tends to be stronger in certain contexts. In particular, the climate conflict link is more consistently observed in countries with low per capita income and weak or undemocratic institutions. These underlying vulnerabilities can amplify the destabilizing effect of climate stressors. Let me show now a couple of graphs that illustrate this pattern. Here, what I've done is something very simple. I use georeference data using the Palmer Drought Severity Index at the grid level and armed conflict locations in countries with with more than one civil conflict event from the UCDP geolocated data set. So the first graph shows the drought and conflict. Not surprising, because we know that climate and climate can affect conflict. We do observe a lot of conflicts occurring in areas where droughts occur, but also where there is a lot of precipitation. So by just looking at this first graph, it's easy to just state, yeah, climate and conflict are related. Conflict cannot create climate, but climate can affect conflict. But then if you use the same, climate conflict events data and overlay it with the economic conditions, the GDP per capita, the middle graph, you will observe that conflicts occur mostly in countries which are poor. And we know from the conflict literature that bad economic conditions it's the most important and the most robust predictor of conflict. And then if we move to the third graph, where now we have again the conflict events overlaid with country political institutions, again we observe that climate change, that conflicts occur in areas or countries where the institutions are not inclusive, they are not democratic. So this is when, it means when, this literature talks that climate change does not affect conflict directly, but it is a threat multiplier. It affects conditions that exist in the country, or it makes conditions such that they are more likely to lead to conflict. And this is what I will discuss now. It's the so-called indirect pathway. Climate change drives conflict through either economic hardship by lowering economic growth, increasing unemployment, leading to crop failure and food insecurity, and also by weakened state capacity, leads to conflict in climate-affected areas. But climate change could also lead to conflict via migration. So environmental migrants move to the new locations where a competition for resources it will occur. We may have also some natives backlashes, and as a result, conflict is going to occur due to environmental migration in receiving areas. There is a lot of backing in theoretical terms on why this should be the case. And most of the theoretical argumentation is drawn from the conflict literature. So the expectation is that climate will increase the risk of violence in large part by creating the economic hardship, because this economic hardship will reduce the opportunity cost of rebellion, which postulates that when farming incomes collapse, food becomes scarce and economic growth stalls, people have less to lose. In these conditions, joining a rebel group or participating in arrest can seem like a rational choice, or even a survival strategy. The second theoretical argumentation emphasizing rising inequality and deepening grievances. Climate shocks rarely affect everyone equally. Vulnerable communities, especially those already marginalized, tend to suffer the most. This can deepen existing economic and political divides, fuel sentiment and sense of injustice, that it could work as a glue, as an element that will resolve the collective action problem for rebellion. And the third one stresses the weakened state capacity. Here it is argued that as climate impacts erode tax revenue and strain government budget, states often struggle to deliver basic services and maintain security. This opened the door to instability, especially in areas where trust in state institutions is already low. There is a lot of evidence, there is evidence that reduced rainfall or temperature increases can slow economic growth and increase the risk of conflict. There is a very well-known study which was published back in 2004, which showed this link for sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this study aimed at examining the effects of the economy on conflict. But given that the relationship is endogenous in the sense that while bad economic conditions lead to conflict, conflict can also deteriorate the economic conditions. So the authors decided to use the annual changes in temperature and precipitation as an instrument for economic conditions, under the assumption that climate can affect or will affect conflict via these worsening economic conditions. There is a lot of research also that, argues that, climate could affect conflict not only via bad economic conditions. And as a result, subsequent studies have found much more mixed results. There were studies which show that there is not such effect, or there is a very weak effect, but What is important here is that it appears that the effects are stronger in authoritative regimes and in ethnically diversified diverse countries where certain groups are political or economic marginalized. It seems again that, the effects of climate via the economic conditions on conflict is conditional upon the democratic institutions. A large number of studies shows that reductions in agricultural output and income due to unfavorable climatic conditions are associated with various types of conflict, including communal violence and civil conflict in different regions of the world, like Africa and Asia, but also in individual countries like India, the Philippines, and Somalia. A recent study using global grid data for almost 25 years, from 1982 to 2015, reveals that the combined effect of climate extremes, again, drought and precipitation, and crop production concentration among four major main crops, maize, wheat, soybean, and rice, increases the predicted probability of conflict onset but as much as 14% in agriculturally dependent countries, which it's a very substantial increase. Climate-induced crop failures can lead to higher food prices, which in turn fuel urban arrest and food riots, especially among the urban poor, who are most sensitive to price spikes. It has been argued that the Arab Spring was partly driven by higher food prices, although there is some kind of disagreement by a few scholars. But it is not just the local effects. Global shocks like droughts in major exporters such as Russia can spark protests in distant food importing countries. Of course, we have seen a similar effect after the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, when there was, this exogenous shock that triggered spikes in food prices. Natural disasters, by reducing the capacity of the governments to deliver services or maintain security, can also give rebel groups space to expand or prolong existing conflicts. In addition, when states fail to respond effectively to disasters, it can also fuel public grievances, particularly in marginalized or neglected regions. And when security forces are stretched thin responding to disasters, it can create openings for terrorist attacks or insurgent activity. Climate change is expected to drive significant migration. The second channel via which pathway via which climate change can affect conflict. There are predictions that the climate change will increase significant migration, especially among vulnerable populations in the global south. The World Bank estimates that up to 216 million people could be displaced by 2050 internally if emissions remain high and development remains uneven. The scale of displacement has raised concerns about security risk. While policymakers often view climate migration as a threat, scholars, on the other hand, take a more nuanced view. The concern, of course, is that when large number of migrants arrive in already fragile areas, competition over jobs, housing, and public services can fuel resentment and social tensions. A well-known example is the Dust Bowl migration in the 1930s America, where newcomers were accused of driving down wages and overburdening local relief efforts, leading to protests. These tensions can be even more intense when migrants face exclusion or belong to different ethnic groups, potentially highlighting grievances and increasing the risk of conflict. Despite a growing body of research, there is still no clear consensus on whether and how climate-induced migration leads to conflict. Some studies argue that climate shocks, like drought, played a major role in triggering events like Syria's civil war, but others strongly disagree. There is the empirical literature using national data is mixed. For instance, some studies link climate migration to violence in Darfur or political rioting in India. But in other contexts like Bangladesh, migrant inflows haven't led to more protest or conflict. A challenge is that most of the studies that are, looked at the climate migration conflict relationship rely on national or regional data from national censuses, which makes it very, very hard to isolate the effects of environmental migration from other political or economic drivers of migration and, of course, conflict. Micro-level research paints a more nuanced picture. It shows that migrants who had fled gradual climatic changes like drought, they are more likely to report they have been discriminated in the cities. And migrants who have fled their place of origin after having experiencing both drought and floods, they are more likely to participate in protests, even if these protests become violent. Now, the point here is that, and I need also to emphasize, is that climate migration might increase the risk of conflict, but it's going to be low levels of urban arrest, like protest or demonstration, rather than full-scale violence, like civil conflict. I need also to state here that how host communities respond to migrants, it's extremely important for how environmental migration will play out. There is some evidence from industrialized countries where citizens, voters, and in particular in the United States and the European Union, who are expressing very sympathetic, very supporting attitudes towards environmental migrants, although they are more supportive of the political than environmental. But still, the environmental migrants are perceived as deserving to come to their country, and the citizens, voters are supposedly to be welcoming them. In research done in the Global South, this type of, the willingness of accepting environmental migrants is not been seen. It seems that urban residents in the Global South do not differentiate between economic and economic and environmental migrants. And this not sympathetic kind of attitude, less sympathetic attitude towards environmental migrants, it can be a barrier to their integration and to building some kind of peaceful relationships in the urban settings. Let me wrap up with a few key takeaways on the climate conflict relationship. First, there is no strong empirical evidence that climate change directly causes intergroup conflict over scarce resources. That link remains debatable. However, rising temperatures have been shown to increase aggression and interpersonal violence like assault and domestic disputes. Yet, we cannot extrapolate this finding from the individual level to the group level because you need to, for a civil conflict or group conflict to occur, the collective action needs to be resolved. Interestingly, it's not just scarcity that can trigger conflict. Resource abundance, for example, from melting ice or heavy rainfall can also spark competition between groups or even states. Climate change can also indirectly raise the risk of conflict by worsening economic hardship and triggering migration, especially in politically or socially fragile societies, countries. These stressors lower the opportunity cost of rebellion, increase grievances, and weaken state capacity. And finally, all of this can create and reinforce a loop where climate impacts increase vulnerability and conflict, which in turn makes societies more exposed to future climate shocks. As warming accelerates, this cycle could intensify. To move this field, one important thing. A couple of years ago, group elicitation assessment stated that the weak governance is a much more consistent predictor of conflict than conflict alone, reinforcing the importance of good governance. To move this field forward, several research directions stand out, at least based on my review of the literature. First, we needed to expand the focus beyond just violent conflict. While much of the literature emphasizes war, conflict, unrest, cooperative responses to climate challenges are far more common and deserve more scholarly attention. Understanding when and why collaboration happens is key to promoting resilience in the face of climatic changes. It is also crucial to unpack the mechanism linking climate and conflict. The evidence is still inconclusive, and we need deeper insights into why climate triggers violence in some cases but not others. This means looking more closely at factors like grievances, state capacity, and economic hardship, ideally using both case studies and large-scale data sets. Governance, economic development, and political stability, as I already have said several times, play a major role in shaping conflict outcomes or cooperative outcomes. Comparative research should shed light on why some countries weather climate stress peacefully while others fall into conflict. We also should dig deeper at the micro level, studying how specific climate events like floods or droughts affect migration patterns, integration challenges, and social tensions in host community, being internal or international. This is essential for designing policies that foster cohesion rather than division. Finally, as the world transitions to cleaner energy, we need to examine the new conflict risk linked to critical minerals like lithium and cobalt. The resource abundance hypothesis. These resources are vital for clean technologies, but concentrate in just a few countries. Research should explore both domestic and global implications for stability and security. Together, these directions can help build a fuller, more policy-relevant understanding of how climate change interacts with conflict dynamics. To address the intersection of climate change, migration, and conflict, several policy priorities emerge. First, we need to invest in sustainable agriculture and diversified economies, especially in vulnerable regions. This recommendation comes directly from the robust evidence that we have, scientific evidence we have that bad agricultural yields are very likely to lead to conflict. But again, it is conditional on the socio-political and economic characteristics of the countries. Sectors like farming, forestry, and fisheries are not only climate sensitive, but also central to livelihoods. Making these sectors more resilient can help tackle root causes of instability like food insecurity and rural poverty, which are major drivers of conflict. At the same time, economic diversification and stronger social safety nets can reduce the economic pressures that push people into migration or unrest. It's also crucial to develop conflict-sensitive migration policies. This should ensure that climate migrants have access to basic services, are integrated into host communities, and don't become sources of tension. Public awareness campaigns can also help shift the narrative, seeing migrants as people in need of support, not as threat. Humanitarian organizations obviously have a key role to play here. We also need to enhance regional cooperation, especially around shared resources like rivers or basins. Multilateral agreements on water use and climate adaptation can help reduce tensions, promote equitable access, and build resilience across borders. In short, cooperation, not competition, should be the goal. And a final key priority is to strengthen governance and institutions. Strong, stable political systems are one of the most effective buffers against conflict, especially under climate stress. When institutions are transparent, inclusive, and responsive to citizens' needs, they can help manage disputes peacefully, deliver essential services, and support communities during environmental shocks. In contrast, weak or unstable governance can magnify the effects of climate change, making societies more vulnerable to unrest. So, investing in good governance is not just a political goal, it's a climate resilient strategy. These approaches taken together offer a pathway not only to reduce conflict risk, but also to build more resilient, inclusive societies in the face of climate challenge. To conclude, the relationship between climate change, migration, and conflicts is complex, but it's not unmanageable. While climate change can act as a threat multiplier, its most damaging effects emerge where governance is weak, inequality is deep, and institutions are fragile. This means that we're not powerless. By investing in inclusive development, strengthening institutions, and fostering cooperation, we can not only reduce the risk of conflict, but also unlock opportunities for climate resilience and social stability. Addressing climate-driven conflict isn't just about reacting to crises. It is about building systems that are better prepared to prevent them. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Koubi. Thank you so much for that really comprehensive overview. I think you've touched on some of the richness that's really described in the paper. We've dropped the link to the paper, the Research and Policy in Brief that Dr. Koubi wrote for the foundation. And as you can see, there's some conversation that's really happening here in the chat. There are a number of questions that we have, and we've got ample time, I think, to get to all of them. What I'll do during this question and answer is go through the questions that we've received, pose them to you. If there are questions that look like they're sort of around the same theme or topic, I might group some of them together, but I'll just put in a reminder again to those in the audience. If you have yet to pose your question, either using the chat function or the Q&A, please feel free to do so, because I believe that we'll get to most of our questions today, this afternoon. So let me begin. One of the questions that came in was around resource scarcity. And this question actually comes in from Ellie Shackleton, who I'll give a shout out to. She was a program assistant here at the foundation until earlier this year. And she actually was instrumental in working with our colleagues, Joel Wallman, in getting this paper done. And so Ellie's question, as I mentioned, is around resource scarcity. And her question is sort of seeing the withholding of resources as a tactic in many current conflicts. What would you say is most clearly observed as a result of oh, I'm sorry, I missed a line here. She says that we see the withholding of resources as a tactic in many current conflicts. So would you say that it's more clearly observed as a result of conflict rather than a direct driver of it?
It can go either way. I mean, in the climate change context, climate change assumed, as I said to already, that it will create water scarcity, land scarcity, and stuff like that, right? So in that case, the assumption is that because you have limited resources, you have a population increase, so there will be a lot of competition for grabbing this kind of resources or get a piece of it. Where, when you limit, you create scarcity, in order to extract something from somebody else, that it is a strategic kind of consideration, which is a different type of reasoning here.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think just on the point that you make in the example that you touch upon in terms of water scarcity, there's another question that came in around that same question, but looks here at the American Southwest. Patricia Rosenfield, who happens to be a board member here at the foundation, has asked if you have examined historical data on water scarcity and conflict, such as in the American Southwest, as I mentioned.
Unfortunately, I haven't. I have looked only on international river basins and to what extent, changes in climate will affect the likelihood of conflict between states. Think, for example, Tajikistan and or any other neighboring country. If Tajikistan wanted to withhold water for, build a dam to withhold water for national use, either, to produce electricity which they can export to other countries. That will imply that, in the springtime when, the countries in the lower, the downstream countries will need the water, they will not receive enough. So in that case, you might have some kind of a dispute between the upstream and the downstream country, unless, of course, the upstream country is both more powerful in military economic terms and also holds the water relatively to the downstream country, which will be weak. If the downstream country is more powerful in military economic terms, then they can use this power in order to coerce the upstream country to release the water earlier, and everything will be fine. But of course, the best situation here is going to be not to use this type of power, is to have some kind of international agreements among all the riparian states that really, state how the water, the shared water is going to be used, how much by everybody, and what is going to happen if the level of the water will be reduced because of climatic changes.
Thank you. And so, in keeping again on the same point, would the sort of Senegal River Basin Authority or the Mekong Basin Authority be an effective conflict prevention strategy due to climate change? So, if we're talking about sort of inter and intrastate institutional arrangements, like what you've discussed.
If the past, so far we know that we didn't have any water wars, for sure. And the main reason is because these international agreements have been effective in reducing the likelihood of conflicts. Now, whether in the future they're going to be able to do that, that's a question mark, because there need to be some kind of renegotiations. If they what, usually what the riparian states do depend on their population and their needs. They allocate percentages of the water, the shared water. These percentages might need to be renegotiated. If it will not happen, then yes, there is the probability is that, or possibility is that conflictual incidents among riparian states might go up.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I'd like to move now just to look at some of the research approaches to long-term versus short-term effects. We have a question here around how studies approach the long-term and sometimes not easily perceptible effects on climate change. And the examples are given here of small variations on the average temperature versus the most sudden effects of climate change, like more frequent droughts and other climatic catastrophes.
That is an excellent question. So we are talking about something like cumulative effects, right? Something that it happens and again and again and again and again. We haven't done that much yet, because usually what we look it's the changes in temperature and precipitation are based, in relation to some, long-term 30 years average change in the temperature and in the precipitation. And this has been done in order to take into consideration that societies, it doesn't matter what, they will adapt a little bit to, to this long-term climatic changes. So all the time we start with a baseline temperature for a specific location from 1950 to 1980, say. You aggregate this to one number, and then you look how after 1980 the temperature and or the water, it's mostly temperature, deviates from this 30-year average in order to estimate the effect of climate, right? Or to measure climate. As I mentioned, this is the best they can do right now, but they're projections, right? People now, they trying to make predictions using models of emissions, and also by, changing some of the parameters. But again, it's predictions. We have very, very few so far. The one that I mentioned earlier, it shows that, yes, in the future, climatic changes, they will get worse. Probably they will have a worse effect on economic conditions, which will increase the likelihood that we will have more conflict. But given that political and economic conditions condition the probability of conflict, then again, we should pay much more attention to the political and economic conditions of the country than the climate.
I'd like to move a little bit and maybe take a step back, because I think much of your report, and especially your key takeaways, talk about this. You talk about sort of collaboration and cooperation over competition, and especially as it comes to sort of international bodies. Um, how do we think about the narratives around climate and climate related, shall we say, violence, or climate, yeah, I'll stick with climate related violence. And I'm thinking, especially as we think about some of the research that you've carried out in the global south, right? So talking about some of the distinctions that you raise between environmental and political migrants, how are the narratives sort of around the ways that those distinctions are made in the global south, or the lack of that distinction being made in the global south, as opposed to that distinction being made, you say, fairly strongly in the global north? What are the narratives and the dominant narratives around climate and migration and climate related violence that show us how these distinctions come about, or how they're then eventually may even lead to policies that are set in countries in the global south, or the global south, or the global north?
Okay. First of all, there is not any legal term about climate migrants, or, I mean, we use the wording, but this doesn't have any legal connotation in the same way that political refugees have. There is no legal protection for environmental migrants. Now, the thing is that, as I already mentioned, it's very, very difficult to disentangle the effect of environment, of climate, as a driver of migration. Because we have instances, I mean, I've done some research where we ask people who have migrated to cities, what was the main reason that they migrated? And surprisingly, people who have left because of a flood or storm, they were very likely to say, yes, I'm an environmental migrant. I left because of the environment. And we could verify that because we could check, we had kept, we recorded their location, and we could see, using actual weather data, whether there was a storm or a flood in that area. People who have migrated because of long-term climatic changes, drought, soil salinity or water salinity, they never said that they left because of the environment. They always say that they're economic migrants. And this is very worrisome, because if these people move to, they move to the cities, they bring their grievances, right, along, because they suffered. They don't usually like to leave their places. We know that people are very, very much attached to their locations, and they don't like to leave. So when these people move, and they move to cities, and there they are not welcome, right? They see themselves, as being discriminated, or they see the local population as to discriminate them or blame them for a lot of things. Then these people, they are more likely to feel more aggrieved, right? More upset. And that it is a kind of bad recipe for peace, because we know from political science, sociology, that grievances and anger very often could materialize in some aggressive behavior. Now, the fact that the northern countries are welcoming political migrants or environmental migrants more than economic migrants, it's good, right? But if most environmental migrants migrate internally, move internally to their countries, and this is what most of the research says right now, environmental migrants, they will move internally, maybe cross the border for a bit, but they're very unlikely to take, this flight to come to Europe or to the United States from Bangladesh or South Africa or, from Africa. They are more likely to stay close by. Of course, here we need to say something that is extremely important. People might leave their rural locations to go to the urban cities because of the climate, the environment, but for a better life. But if after 5 years they haven't made it and now they move to Europe, at this point they're not considered environmental migrants, they're economic migrants because the environmental factor has been occurring long time before.
Thank you for that clarification. Sticking on this on the internal migration, there is a question here around climate impact on nomadic communities. So the question is around what's happened. What happens when nomadic communities do not have greener pastures for their livestock? This question is really around the Nigerian example. So climate change has seriously fueled conflicts between herders and farmers in northern Nigeria, and this question is around what that direct link is.
There is some evidence which, we know, I was reading a paper lately which shows that how pastoralists have started changing their routes. And they have changing their routes because, the droughts are not only, I'm not sure about Algeria, but I've read that for Mali, for West Africa. This is something that we have observed that conflicts, there is a lot of evidence studying Kenya and different, countries in Africa showing that, droughts increase the likelihood that migrants, pastoralists will fight with the farmers. And actually, what it has been observed lately is that even when, rainfall comes, it comes later than it used to. And now what we see is that there is also the movement, not only the pastoralists, the herders need to travel even farther, but also they are more likely to arrive in places where the farmers have not harvested their crops. And then what you have is the animals instead of going and eating what is left, the roots, now they're fed on crops that they're about to be harvested. And this makes, of course, the likelihood that you will have some clashes between these two groups more likely. Of course, again, there are some studies which show is to what extent you are not necessarily, there is not necessarily the need to have government rules. Customary rules also had played an important role in mitigating clashes between the pastoralists and the herders.
Thank you. There's a number of questions, some around peace building and others around sort of the role of individuals. Before we get to those, one thing I wanted to just pick up on that was an example that you put, and I wonder if you could just expand on this debate a little bit for us. And I'll take the opportunity to ask the question as I'm sort of moderating this Q&A here. But could you expand a bit more around the debate between the connection within the Arab Spring on food price shock? What is the debate that is happening within the literature around the Arab Spring's connection to climate?
Okay, so we know that the food prices went up because of the drought, but also it was not also the drought that occurred in the region, but also there was drought in Russia. There was which increased the prices. Also, there were rains in China and in Australia. So it was 2010. It was a very bad year. So people complained about, the increase in the prices. So we did have this uprising, but this uprising did not lead to conflict in Northern Africa everywhere. There were many countries from Egypt to Tunisia where, this protest end up with, peacefully, and also in some instances we had a change in the political arena. But also we had an instance like Syria, right, where, the Arab Spring ended in a civil conflict, and a civil conflict that has been, fought for a very long time. So again, it is how the political elite reacts to these demands, to the demands of the people for, for help when, economic conditions and economic conditions can be worse enough also because of the climate. The conditions, the economic well-being of those people is hurting. And that's why I kept saying, I said several times during my presentation that political institutions matter. The drought, that occurred in Syria didn't occur only Syria. Jordan, Cyprus, Lebanon, Israel, all of those, Egypt, all of those suffered a drought. And yet we have a civil conflict only in one area. There is, of course, some evidence which says, yes, it's true. Because of the drought, a lot of farmers left and they moved to Damascus, Aleppo, into the big cities. But these people, when they moved to the cities, they stayed in the periphery, in some informal settlements. The government didn't really help them. And at the same time, you had, and that was probably 1 million internal migrants. And then you had another million or so political migrants or people coming from Iraq. These people had an agenda. They wanted something. They wanted some kind of political change. And they find the opportunity to recruit Syrians who, as I said, the opportunity cost of rebellion was very low. There was nothing for them to do, and the government was not helping out. So recruitment was easy. Of course, the opposition there found it very opportune to start fighting against Assad. Assad responded very crudely against his own people, and you have a conflict. Where in Tunisia, you had a change in the political arena. You have a change, you had a new constitution, you had new courts, you had a new setting, political setting. So the conflict did never escalated beyond and above the protests.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for just unpacking that a little bit more. We have a number of questions here that are really around solutions. The first one talks about the roles of individuals. So we've got a question here that's asking the intersection between resource scarcity, climatic change, and intergroup relation can be threatening to countries with weak governments, as you've outlined. It is more a systemic challenge, or is it more a systemic challenge than a personal one? Or sorry, this is more a systemic challenge than a personal one. However, to what extent do individuals play a role in averting the conflict that comes from climate change?
Conflicts can occur at different scales. It can occur at the individual level, it can occur at the village level, at more extended regional level up to the national level. We know more. Observational data shows that yes, bad climatic conditions trigger cooperation between, cooperation. But the question is, and this is something that we have not examined sufficiently yet, is it cooperation within the group or between the groups? We know from sociology, psychology, and the like that people tend to cooperate mostly with people who are similar because they trust, right? They see each other. They have some kind of common characteristics. And if, climate is to worsen their livelihoods, the expectation is that you're going to have more an in-group kind of cohesiveness than towards the out-groups, because the out-groups, they're coming to take all, some of the limited resources you have. But there is some evidence that even under these circumstances, people are helpful. They will help people who are different than those. But we do not know enough in the context of climate change. I mean, I do some research in Bangladesh right now, and we do find both. We found instances where, there is a lot of cooperation, not only in group, but also out group, but also there is a lot of hostility. And also there are different type of, help that the people were going to provide. It's easier, to provide a settler and food than, provide somebody with money and for the long run. Because also this means in the global south, and especially in rural areas, it's extremely limited. So we as individuals, what we can do, support any type of initiative that not only aims at mitigating the greenhouse emissions, but any initiative that aims at helping the populations in this global south to adapt to climate change. To remove, the need to migrate, and especially given that people do not want to go. I mean, I've been about 10 countries asking people about this, and I don't find anyone pretty much who says, I will be very happy to go because of the climate. There are many who would like to move because of economic reasons. They like to improve themselves, because they like to be educated, because of social needs. They like to live a different type of lifestyle. But everybody needs to stay. So if they like to stay, a lot of people like to stay. This implies that they need help to adapt. You need to provide the means, to make their life livable where they are.
Mhm. Thank you. And I think that dovetails quite nicely into sort of a question that moves away from the individual and focuses specifically on the United Nations. Um, what is the role that you see for international bodies like UNEP or the UN Security Council, and their role where research shows that conflict is linked strongly to climate change? This was a question here that we got around, international cooperation and collaboration. I think, especially given the current moment that the UN finds itself in, what are your thoughts really on the role of this international body?
In general, climate change, it's the biggest failure that we ever had. And the reason is that every country in the international system, we perceive climate change as a threat or not, depending on their endowments, on their preferences, their tastes. And unfortunately, not every country in the international system is being affected or will be affected in a similar way. So you will have countries who suffer a lot, and they would like international cooperation because this is the only way we can solve this problem. Climate change is a global public good. Everybody needs to contribute. So if, the United States see climate change as not a problem, but many other countries see it as a problem, you cannot really have a meaningful cooperation. But it's not there. It's not only that. Even if the United Nations, the Security Council comes and say climate change, it's a huge problem. We need to act. Yeah, you need money. Who is going to pay for it? So every country will start arguing on how to contribute, to distribute resources on how to deal with climate change. And again, you will have a problem. So climate change is extremely difficult problem, wicked problem, as some people call it, which makes international collaboration extremely difficult. And we know that only and only if every country, or at least the biggest emitters of greenhouse emissions, should be part of any collaborative effort. Otherwise, we cannot deal with it. And because mitigation, that is going to be a very nice solution, but I do not think we can make it on time to avoid bigger catastrophes. Adaptation is something that really needs to be pushed. But again, we might have problems on who's going to contribute to the climate fund and how much and how the money is going to distribute it afterwards.
Yeah, a wicked problem indeed, as you call it. I'd like to move to some of our final questions here. One is there are a couple of questions around specific areas of research and regions that you've worked on. We have a question here around climate and conflict in Kenya, and we've got a question that's asking you just to expand a little bit more what your main observations are of Kenya in particular and some of the research that you've carried out there. What have been some of your key takeaways from the Kenyan reality when it comes to research on climate change and conflict locally?
Okay. In Kenya, we did find, as I mentioned, that people who have been exposed to both droughts and floods, they are more keen to participate in protests, even in the violent protests. I mean, asking people, it's extremely difficult in scientific research, and sometimes it's obviously unethical, to ask this type of questions. What ideally should be the case is observe people doing those things, right? So, but we cannot do it. It's not ethical to do that. So we always make scenario via which we ask them, how they will act. And we did see that people who have experienced floods and droughts are much more likely to participate in this type of protests than people who had not experienced. And at the same time, we know that these people feel discriminated in the urban settings. And it is also Kenyans in Mombasa and Nairobi, Kisumu, who do not see the environmental migrants as being more deserving than economic migrants. Of course, there is an explanation to this, right? In Africa or in Southeast Asia, there is a huge migratory trend, right? There is, the urbanization rate is extremely high. People moving from the rural areas to go to the urban cities in order to improve their lives. And it's not necessarily because of environmental reasons. And so it might be the case that a lot of our respondents, in surveys, they are the ones who might be ones who left their locations either because of economic reasons or environmental reasons, or they know people that they migrated because of those. So they don't make a differentiation. Of course, if you have more environmental migrants than economic migrants in the future, and you know that these people might be, constrain your well-being, because we know that they like people, migrants who are educated, they like migrants who have some kind of income, so they will not pose a burden to the city services. They like younger people, so they have a preference for those. But what about the environmental migrants? Usually they are not that educated, they don't have resources, and most likely they're the ones who will need more help than some other ones. So, but if the urbanites do not feel more sympathy for them, you will have more grievances, discrimination grievances, and then you have not a cooperative environment, but rather a conflictual one.
And I'm seeing, the time flies really, because this conversation is so rich. There's so many fantastic questions, but I think we have time just for one more. So I'll ask a question that's come in around environmental conservation and preservation efforts. And the question is about how environmental conservation and preservation efforts fit into links between climate change and conflict. While environmental conservation clearly has its merits, is there research investigating links between unintended consequences of conservation efforts, climate change, and the subsequent displacement of populations or conflict? And if so, what has this research shown?
Uh, yes, there is some. They show that conservation efforts put communities, either the ones that they used to be in the conservation, they will be asked to leave, or if they live along the area, they will see their livelihoods deteriorating. And there is often the case, I mean, a couple of papers that I know of, which have reported conflicts between, the agencies that they're trying to conserve some, some forest or areas, coming in conflict with the local communities.
Thank you. I'm going to get one more question in for the audience. I'm trying to get to as many questions as we can. So I'll go ahead and ask the question around the link. Oh, this is around the Lake Chad Basin. We've got a question here that's looking at policy or governance reform. So given the clear link between climate change, resource scarcity, and conflict in the Lake Chad Basin, what policy or governance reforms are most urgently needed to break the cycle of violence and displacement, especially considering reports that some government officials are directly contributing to resource competition?
Okay, governance, right? Corruption and the like, it's part of the governance. So, there is the situation there, you have, you have this, the climate conflict, and bad governance, contributed to a stalemate there. So governance is extremely important. I mean, this is the only thing I could say. There is a lot of exploitation, not only by the government, but also by militant groups. And you do have a lot of incoming people who come, for the lake, but the lake's shrinking. So yeah, this is a situation that magnifies this, interlinkage between climate, poverty, governance, and conflict.
Yeah. And I think, of course, if we had more time, we've talked some about the individual level responses to climate change and individual level violence. We've also talked about sort of the macro, right, the international and the state level reactions. I think that there's a conversation to be had, of course, if we had more time, around sort of the semi-local, right? I think there's interesting conversations around, and I'm sure that there's research you could speak to this around sort of the role of cities and urban centers as being, part of the vanguard of how we frame, how we understand, and how we counter climatic change. So unfortunately, we are getting to the end of our time together, and I hope that we were able to incorporate as much of the knowledge, the questions, and the expertise from our audience who stayed with us until the end of this session. But I would like to close really just by thanking you once again, Dr. Vally Koubi, for leading us through this conversation, for outlining sort of how big or how wicked this problem of climate change and conflict really is, and for also breaking down and giving us such a rich overview of the recent report, the Research and Policy in Brief that you wrote for the foundation. You were able to give several examples from around the world about the direct and indirect pathways that lead to conflict due to climatic change. And as is often the case, this conversation could have continued for several more hours, as I said, but I do have the duty of bringing us to a close. And so I thank not only you, but all of the audience members who stayed with us here until the end. As I mentioned at the top of this session, this video, along with the summary of the discussion, will be made available on hfg.org. We ask you to please follow HFG on our social media platforms. You can get more information about our upcoming speaker series events, other events that we host, publications, grants, and funding opportunities. So you can follow us on Twitter at HF Guggenheim and on Facebook and LinkedIn at Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at the next installment of HFG's Knowledge Against Violence speaker series. Dr. Koubi, thank you so much.